Good evening. These are the main news headlines today. The U.S. threatened retaliation against Libya for backing Europe's airport terrorists. Winnie Mandela was arrested in South Africa. In Seattle, 10 people were convicted in the trial of a Nazi-like group called The Order. Details of these stories in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, 2 Palestinians and an Israeli journalist continue the discussion about the airport terrorist attacks. Paul Warnke and Richard Pearl exchange differences over stopping nuclear tests. And we have a report from Washington State on gambling on Indian reservations.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The Reagan administration said today that all the evidence in the airport massacres in Europe points to the radical Palestinian splinter group headed by Abu Nidal with backing from Libya. The White House said Libya had given Nidal financial assistance and an operating base and had applauded the attacks in Rome and Vienna last Friday. Presidential spokesman Larry Speakes also indicated that the U.S. might take action against Libya. He said, "Our policy is that you seek out those responsible and have at it. Go at them." At the State Department, spokesman Charles Redmond spelled out the charges against Libya.
Libya has applauded the attacks at Rome and Vienna airports, calling them, according to their own news agency, heroic actions. We believe Qaddafi has given Abu Nidal, his group, a considerable amount of financing and assistance. We know that Abu Nidal and many other terrorist groups have benefited from and perhaps could not have survived without the assistance of countries which have supported terrorism. The weapons, the explosives, the training, rest areas, safe houses, and other such facilities have been invaluable.
The administration refused to specify what form of retaliation against Libya it might take. The White House spokesman said, "We believe that other governments now recognize the need to take action. We are ready to work with them on coordinated efforts." Austria's interior minister said that the terrorists who attacked Vienna Airport were not on a suicide mission. Interior Minister Karl BLITZER said they intended to take hostages on an Israeli plane to Tel Aviv and carry out further acts of terror there. The Tunisian government said it had traced 3 passports used by the terrorists in Vienna to Libya. A Tunisian official said one had been lost in Libya 8 years ago and 2 others were confiscated last fall from Tunisian migrant workers. Jim?
The youngest to die in the Friday attacks was buried today in Rome. She was 11-year-old Natasha Simpson, daughter of the Associated Press news editor in Rome. Her father, Victor Simpson, and her 9-year-old brother were wounded as they were all preparing to fly home to the United States for the holidays. More than 300 people, including U.S. Ambassador Maxwell Rabb and a representative of the Pope, attended today's Mass for Natasha. In the Middle East today, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Syria for his first visit in 6 years. Hussein is to meet with Syrian President Assad. Here is a report from Rob Muir of Viz News.
For Jordan's King Hussein, it's been a long time between visits, almost 7 years. The last time he set foot on Syrian ground was in 1977, but at that time relations between the 2 countries were at breaking point. Syria had accused Jordan of being partly responsible for several anti-government attacks in Damascus, and it was only 5 years ago that the neighbouring countries were on the brink of war. But now, thanks to an Arab League committee established earlier this year, both Syrian President Assad and King Hussein are talking again. The purpose of this visit was merely to seal the pact. Jordan's press are hailing the occasion as a great step towards overall Arab unity. Syria expects the meeting to forge a better understanding on the Arab struggle against Israel. The Israelis see it as nothing but a hindrance to finding peace in the Middle East.
In Pakistan, President Mohammad Zia al-Haq declared an end to more than 8 years of martial law and restored basic civil rights. He said that the new democratic order, as he called it, would be an extension of military rule and cautioned against radical changes. Pakistan's opposition party denounced Zia's declaration as lies and frauds.
And that concludes our summary of the news of this day. We move now to a look at what the Vienna and Rome killings have done to the Palestinian cause, to Warnke versus Pearl on the question of nuclear testing, and to a report from Washington State about gambling on Indian reservations.
Our first and major focus tonight is the fallout from the two terrorist airport attacks in Rome and Vienna last Friday. And we look first at reaction among Palestinians. In Tunis, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, condemned the raids.
I am sorry to say that some intelligence services, Arab intelligence services, are behind it. They are gathering small youth, training them, arming them, financing them, then pushing them. Then they are pushing them to do these operations in different parts of the world to spoil the picture of the Arab nation and the legal Palestinian resistance and struggle. So this volcano will never stop until we have to do all our best to cooperate, to find a peaceful, just, comprehensive, lasting peace.
Wire service reports say a majority of Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank also condemned the attacks. For an unofficial Palestinian view, we have two Palestinians, SAHLIYYEH, visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington and a professor at Birzeit University on the West Bank, and RASHID KHALIDI, professor of political science at Columbia University's Middle East Institute. Mr. KHALIDI, first of all, the remarks we just heard by Yasser Arafat disassociating the PLO from this, will that carry weight generally, or are Palestinians and as a whole in their movement going to get blamed for this, do you think?
I think there has been a tendency to blame the PLO for a number of incidents which it would seem it had nothing to do with. I think this is partly the objective of the people who are carrying these attacks out. And I think it's partly a result of an attempt by Israel to sort of stick everything onto the PLO in the hope that it can be portrayed as too horrible, too bestial, too terroristic to deal with in negotiations.
Mr. SAHLIYYEH, what do you see as the intention of these terrorists?
In fact, they could be playing the inter-Palestinian, inter-Arab rivalries. One of the motives, it seems to me, behind the attack is to prove and to disprove Arafat signing of the Cairo Accord, where Arafat declared that the PLO will no longer carry out military activities or operations outside the occupied territories. So, in a way, the attack on Rome and Vienna were directed to disprove such a pledge. Plus, it is used by certain Arab regimes against the PLO and against Arafat in particular. I think it is senseless, it is it leads nowhere, such terrorist activities. They only harm our cause. And as Dr. Khalidi said, it only serves the interests of those who want to picture the Palestinians as terrorists and not worthwhile talking to.
Mm-hmm. One of the terrorists who survived apparently told Austrian officials today that he was born in one of the refugee camps in Lebanon, and the Shatila refugee camp, and that the others were recruited there. What is the appeal of such extremist terrorist groups to young men in those refugee camps to get them to come and almost inevitably give their lives as they do in these things?
Well, you have an extraordinary degree of frustration in the refugee camps in Lebanon, and I would guess also in some of the camps under Israeli occupation. In the case of Lebanon, you have a situation which has gone from bad to worse. Before the 82 war, before the 82 Israeli invasion, the situation was very difficult. There was a lot of pressure. Since then, it has gotten much, much worse. The massacres in 82, and fighting
in
around
those camps.
In those camps. Economically, it's gotten worse. The economic situation in Lebanon is terrible, and people in the camps have suffered. And politically, it's very, very bad.
Well, what is the nature of their frustration? I mean, apart from conditions living in those camps, what is the political nature of the frustration?
The conditions are the background. The political roots of the frustration lie in the fact that it would seem to most Palestinians that avenues towards a negotiated settlement in which they could get their minimum national aspirations are being blocked off. The idea of direct Palestinian participation, the idea of a Palestinian state, which is what seemed to be the consensus of Palestinian politics a few years ago, seems to be getting further and further away.
But Mr. SAHLIYYEH just says, Professor SAHLIYYEH just says that their aim is to prevent a negotiated settlement or to prevent moderate steps towards a negotiated settlement.
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the young men who carry out the attacks and the people who plan them. I think the people who carry out the attacks are frustrated, angry, bitter, resentful. They've lived through massacre and so on, mayhem. People who plan them do, I think, have exactly the objective that Professor SAHLIYYEH talked about.
Who are cynically manipulating the frustrations of the young.
I would think so, yeah.
Now, are such groups, such radical or extremist groups within the Palestinian community, are they gaining support? Are they gaining recruits, Mr. SAHLIYYEH?
Let me just comment on the same question that you asked Dr. Khalidi, and then I will come back to the second question. I think the question of frustration is also witnessed within the occupied territories, whereby we have a whole generation of young men that have been born shortly before or after 1967 June War. For these people, they have no dreams, no hopes. Their whole experience has been with settlers, soldiers, settlements, expropriation of land. And the Arab, as well as Palestinian and international attempts to extricate them from Israeli occupation has so far failed. So for this group of young men, the only example for them is that Israel was forced to withdraw from southern Lebanon only under the pressure of arms. That's why you see the increase in the level of violence within the occupied territories in the last few months.
Well, is the recruitment, and are these increasing? Are these groups expanding as a proportion of the Palestinian community?
It seems to me one of the main variables that will determine whether such radical groups will be on the rise or they will diminish is what will happen with the peace process. If the current attempts, and unfortunately they are not going anywhere, were to lead to an endless situation, this will most likely tip the balance in favor of the hardline minority who believes that the Israelis as well as the United States are not at all determined to bring a just settlement to the Palestinian question, and therefore the resort to arms will be the only feasible option. So it all depends upon what will happen with the peace process.
Do you see these extremist groups, these anti-Arafat groups opposed to negotiation, do you see them increasing in size?
I think that since 1982, it has probably been the case that there has been a proliferation of opposition to the idea of a negotiated settlement as far as political manifestations are concerned. I don't know as far as popular opinion is concerned. Nobody asks most Palestinians. In the occupied territories, the last time they were asked was in 1976 when they voted in elections and elected a PLO slate of mayors. Nobody asks people. So I would suggest that probably in terms of manifestations, organizations, secret terrorist groups, there has probably been an increase. But popular opinion, it's hard to say.
Now, you both said at the beginning that this could harm the cause of peace. What specifically do you think, or what is this specific incident going to do to whatever momentum there was in the what's called the peace process?
I tend to think that if there is really momentum, an incident like this would not have a major impact. I think that when things are not really moving along, and I agree with Professor SAHLIYYEH, they're not moving right now. Yeah. Something like this can be seized upon by those who don't want progress. Something like this becomes an almost insuperable obstacle, and we go off into side alleys.
So that's where we are now, you
I'm
think?
afraid so, yes.
Do you agree with that, Professor SAHLIYYEH?
Oh, certainly. The problem is that the incidents of this sort will only serve for the Israelis to reconvince those sector or that sector within the Israeli public that the Palestinians are not worthwhile talking to. It will also deter the moderate Palestinians within and outside the occupied territories from moving forward and taking more bold initiative. At the same time, it will also probably deter Jordan from moving forcefully in the direction of peace, particularly since the diplomatic activism of the United States has been extremely and unfortunately very low.
Well, we'll come back in a moment, gentlemen. Jim?
Next, an Israeli perspective from Wolf Blitzer, Washington correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and author of a new book on U.S.-Israeli relations entitled Between Washington and Jerusalem. First, the anti-Palestinian view within Israel, is it bolstered by what happened Friday in Vienna and Rome?
Yeah. Yes, I think it's clear that whenever these types of terrorist incidents occur, those in Israel who don't see any profitability of entering into real negotiations with the Palestinians, those views, of course, are strengthened.
What is the official Israeli view now as to who is responsible for these attacks?
Well, the defense minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, has publicly said that it looks like Abu Nidal, a splinter group of the PLO opposed to Yasser Arafat, backed by Libya, occasionally by Syria, is probably responsible. And this is, of course, the opinion that the United States government expressed today as well.
The U.S. Position, does that mean, do you smell that some kind of attack on Libya is now in the works?
Well, I wouldn't be wholly surprised if something were in the works against Libya. I don't know if an attack per se. I don't anticipate an immediate Israeli military response to this particular action.
Why not?
Generally, whenever the conventional wisdom is that Israel will respond militarily, Israel doesn't. When no one expects it, the element of surprise is there, then Israel usually does. In this particular case, yes, El Al was a target, and one Israeli citizen was killed. Several were injured. But there were other countries also involved. The incidents occurred in Italy and in Vienna and in Austria. Americans were killed, Greek nationals, all sorts of other nationals were involved. And since everyone assumes that Abu Nidal, backed by Libya, were in fact the culprits, then it seems like an opportunity for Israel to work together with the United States and Western European nations in trying to forge some sort of joint strategy. Whether that's a military strategy, a diplomatic strategy, an economic strategy is of course unclear, but I don't think right now Israel's going to unilaterally try to locate Abu Nidal or his people and strike militarily. I would be surprised if Israel were to do so. And of course, if Israel were to go in Lebanon now and try to seek out some sort of PLO groups or Palestinian groups in Lebanon or Syria, there's this added complication of the recent deployment of new surface-to-air missiles by Syria on both sides of the Lebanese border, which could cause a major escalation.
Now, Friday, Rabin, the defense minister in Israel, said that he held Yasser Arafat responsible. Now, that has changed as of today, correct?
Right, but indirectly, the Israelis still continue to hold Arafat responsible, and the logic is that since the PLO under Arafat, the mainstream of the PLO, loyal to Arafat, have themselves over the past few months undertaken terrorist actions, specifically the incident in Larnaca, Cyprus, when 3 Israelis were killed, and other incidents as well. The Israeli argument is that they create a climate in which all of the various Palestinian groups sort of have to compete to see who's going to cause the most spectacular type of operation against Israel. So indirectly, the Israelis see the PLO as partially responsible for this, even though they didn't specifically organize this incident.
But you think it's very unlikely that Israel would take retribution directly against a PLO headquarters or a PLO camp per se. Is that correct?
Against the PLO group loyal to Arafat?
Yes.
I would be surprised right now, and I also have to suggest that there's this element of public relations. Israel went through a rough period in recent weeks with this Jonathan Pollard spy scandal and strains between the U.S. and Israel.
This was a Defense Department intelligence man who sold U.S. secrets to the Israelis.
Right, and then there were serious strains that erupted in U.S.-Israeli relations, and Israel suffered in terms of PR quite extensively. Right now, that relationship, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, is getting back together, back where it was. And I don't think Israel is going to want to do anything right now that is going to exacerbate its relationship with the United States. If Israel were to respond militarily within the next few days, it would be only, in my opinion, if they have a clear green light from the Reagan administration, go ahead and do it, and we will support you. If Israel does it, it's going to be only if it has that kind of authorization from Washington.
Okay, thank you. Robin?
Mr. Khalidi, does Arafat, the terrorism that, or the attacks that he sanctions, create a climate for terrorism which people like Abu Nidal compete to excel in?
I think that most of the operations that the PLO has engaged in, and you have to make a distinction between Abu Nidal, whose group was never part of the PLO, who's been sentenced to death by the PLO, who has tried to kill, whose group apparently killed a member of the PLO executive committee and several PLO ambassadors. You have to distinguish between them and between the mainstream factions. Those mainstream factions generally have carried out operations which they describe as resistance to occupation, and they've focused on the occupied West Bank and Gaza and sometimes Israel itself. That's what the Cairo Declaration, in which Arafat said that would be the only kind of thing the Palestinians engaged in.
But the killing of 3 people aboard a yacht in Cyprus wouldn't fall into that.
It certainly wouldn't. It certainly wouldn't. It would seem that a lot of the attacks that take place abroad, perhaps a very large number of them, are the work of factions that are opposed to Arafat. That is to say, people who are trying to blacken the name of the PLO, and people who are in fact very much opposed to the PLO itself. There's some information now that some of the passports used in the MacNeil-Lehrer affair have links with passports that have been used by some of the people who carried out this attack. So the initial condemnation of the PLO, for example, for that, which was perplexing in view of the fact that it seemed to be an illogical operation for the PLO to carry out, may well have been part of this hounds baying after the hare sort of process where everybody blames things on the PLO, even in those situations where it's not responsible.
Mr. SAHLIYYEH, what do you know about Abu Nidal and his group? Mr. Khalidi's just told us that he's never been a member of the PLO proper.
In fact, Abu Nidal group split from the PLO after the civil war in Jordan in 1970. And the Abu Nidal group first went to Iraq and was hosted by the Iraqi government for almost a decade and was operating against the PLO. Early 80s, Abu Nidal group was given some sort of refuge in Damascus, and most recently they have been quoted by the Libyans. Abu Nidal group is opposed to or sees that the diplomatic maneuvering that Arafat is engaging in are counterproductive. They would not lead to peace. It would lead to a liquidation of the Palestinian cause, and it deviates from the principle of liberating all of Palestine. So basically they feel that they have to liberate all of Palestine, and the means to be used is armed struggle. And they see Arafat deviating sharply from such a policy through his diplomatic accord with Jordan and willingness to attend an international peace conference.
And Mr. Khalidi, is there a man, Abu Nidal, an actual individual?
There is indeed. He was a former member of the Fatah leadership.
The Al-Fatah, which was the military wing of the PLO.
Which is one of the main constituent groups of the PLO. And he was reported to have been killed about a year ago. He has either resurfaced or...
Someone is using his name.
Or his group goes on. Apparently, the individual known as Abu Nidal was very, very violently opposed to the shift in course taken by the PLO early in the 70s. And he has managed to recruit a large number of young, frustrated individuals who, in many cases, are very, very, very much brainwashed, apparently.
Now, let's turn to the question, if Libya is giving him the aid and comfort that the U.S. and the Israelis and others say, if the U.S. and the Israelis were to retaliate against Abu Nidal in Libya, what would the Palestinian movement as a whole think about that?
Well, the PLO has suffered greatly at the hands of Abu Nidal. It has lost a half dozen ambassadors and 2 or 3 other senior leaders. If Abu Nidal himself or the group were the target, I don't think very many tears would be shed in the bulk of the Palestinian movement.
Do you agree with that, Mr. SAHLIYYEH?
Yes, I do.
And what would the feeling be if some of the other options for retaliation were taken? For instance, Wolf Blitzer mentioned possible targets in Lebanon. Mr. SAHLIYYEH.
I don't think to hit at targets in Lebanon will be at all possible, because as reports have indicated, it's Abu Nidal is responsible, or the group of Abu Nidal is responsible for the operation. And if attacking Lebanon will only lead to further violence and counter-violence, it would only help to produce additional groups that will carry out such activities in terms of revenge.
Wolf Blitzer, if they went after Abu Nidal himself, wouldn't that tend to cleanse Mr. Arafat's reputation, which some people, and according at least to our two Palestinian guests, some people in Israel haven't been too anxious to do?
Well, it's not going to be that easy to go after Abu Nidal. If in fact he's in Libya, the Libyans have their own surface-to-air defense system, and the Libyans have been backed quite extensively by the Soviet Union, even in the past few weeks, as all of these reports have surfaced in Washington, that the Reagan administration itself was considering some sort of contingency plans to undermine Qaddafi's regime in Libya. The Soviets in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Mediterranean in general have undertaken all sorts of maneuvers and actions which have been interpreted, at least by responsible authorities here in Washington and elsewhere, as representing an indication that the Soviets would respond to some sort of provocation or outside action against Libya. So it's by no means certain that a aerial surgical strike against Libya is feasible, at least at this stage.
Well, gentlemen, a complicated situation. We will leave it there. Wolf Blitzer, EMILE SAHLIYYEH, and RASHID KHALIDI, thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, veteran arms negotiator Paul Warnke and Defense Department official Richard Pearl disagree on stopping nuclear tests, and we have a report on how gambling helps pay the bills on Indian reservations in Washington state.